The storm that changed everything. The storm came through on a Tuesday night and left before Wednesday arrived, fast, indifferent, and considerably more destructive than anything that moves so quietly has any right to be. He was awake before it finished, lying in the dark of my apartment on West Carey Street in Richmond, listening to the wind press itself against the windows like something desperate trying to get in, and I thought about the farm the way I always thought about it at 3 in the morning, not with any plan, just with the low, persistent ache of a man who knows something important is sitting 47 miles away and is not yet sure he deserves to go back to it. Margaret had loved that farm completely, without apology, without reservation, without any of the careful distance that some people keep between themselves and the things they care about most. She had grown up on her parents' land in the Shenandoah Valley, running through fields that had been in her family for 4 generations, learning the names of every bird and tree and wildflower that grew along the creek that bordered the eastern property line. When her father left her the property outside Charlottesville, she had walked every acre of it with mud on her boots and come back to the house with her eyes bright and her cheeks flushed with the particular joy of a woman who had just been given back something she had not realized she had been missing. She had planted the rose garden our second spring there. Not because she was following some predetermined plan or because the landscaping needed it, but because she woke up one morning in early March and said, "Richard, I need to put something in the ground that will still be here after we're gone." He had watched her spend the next 6 weekends on her knees in the cold Virginia soil, her hands raw and her back aching, never complaining once, because she was doing something she believed in and that made every other consideration secondary. She had carried the oak home herself in a burlap sack in the back of her Jeep, a sapling then, nothing more than a slender stem with a few leaves at the top, the kind of thing most people would have walked past without a second glance. But Margaret had seen something in it, had held it with both hands like it was precious, and had walked to the middle of the garden and dug a hole with the same care she brought to everything she did, and she had set that sapling in the ground as if she were planting a cathedral. Over the years, it had grown into something that made visitors stop and simply look, the way people stopped for things that had taken a very long time to become what they were. Its branches spread wide and generous, offering shade to anyone who needed it, and its roots went deep into the Virginia soil, holding the earth together through droughts and floods and all the ordinary mercies and cruelties of weather. When the wind blew, the sound it made was not the sharp, brittle sound of a tree that was barely hanging on, but the deep, resonant sigh of something that had been standing for a very long time and intended to keep standing. 3 years ago, I had stood beside that oak and watched them lower Margaret into the ground 20 feet from its roots. She had chosen that spot herself, months before she died, when she still had enough strength to walk out to the garden and point and say, "Right here, Richard. Under the tree I planted the spring we moved in, that's where I want to be." I had tried to argue with her, had tried to suggest the family plot in Charlottesville, something more conventional that would be easier for visitors to find, but she had looked at me with that particular expression she got when she had made up her mind about something and was not going to be moved, and she had said, "Richard, I spent my whole life in this garden. I'm not going to spend my death somewhere else." After that, I had come back to Richmond and stayed, because every corner of the farm spoke in her voice and I was not always strong enough to listen. The kitchen table where she had sat every morning with her coffee and her garden catalogs, marking pages with the particular care of a woman who was planning for next spring because she believed in next spring even when she knew she might not be there to see it. The porch where she had sat in the evenings, watching the sun set over the fields, her hand in mine, the two of us not needing to talk because we had already said everything that mattered. The garden itself, every plant and path and carefully placed stone bearing the unmistakable signature of a woman who had touched this earth and made it better for having done so. He had stayed away for 3 years because coming back felt like coming back to a house where the person who made it a home was no longer there to open the door. He had told myself I was being practical, that the company needed me in Richmond, that the commute would be too much, that the memories were too painful to face. But the truth was simpler and harder than any of those rationalizations. I was afraid. He was afraid that if I went back to the farm, I would feel her absence so completely that I would not be able to bear it, and I was afraid that if I went back, I would not feel her at all, that the place where she had been would have become just another piece of property, stripped of everything that had made it sacred. My phone rang at 5:15 in the morning. I knew it was Carol Simmons before I looked at the screen. Not because I had any special intuition, but because there are some calls that come at certain hours and you know what they mean before you even answer them. Carol had been managing the property for 18 years, hired by Margaret when we still lived there full-time, when the farm was still our primary residence and the city apartment was just a place I stayed when business kept me late. She had arrived at the farm as a practical, no-nonsense woman in her late 30s who knew more about soil chemistry than anyone I had ever met, and she had stayed because Margaret had treated her not as an employee but as a partner, someone whose expertise was respected and whose voice mattered. She did not call before sunrise unless waiting felt irresponsible, and she was not the kind of woman who used the word emergency lightly. The old oak came down, she said, her voice tight with the effort of holding itself steady, not the tightness of someone trying to keep you calm, but the tightness of someone who was holding herself together and needed you to know that she was holding herself together so that you could hold yourself together too. The root ball pulled clean out of the ground. It took most of the rose bed with it. There's a hole out there, Mr. Bennett, 4 feet deep, maybe 6 across. She stopped, and I heard her take a breath that was not quite steady. And there's something else. Something you need to see yourself. I dressed in the dark of my apartment, the familiar shapes of the furniture feeling suddenly foreign and strange. He left half a cup of coffee on the counter, the mug still warm from the coffee I had poured without thinking because I had been making coffee at 15 pulgadas the morning for 40 years and my hands knew what to do even when my mind was somewhere else entirely. He sent Daniel a text to cover the morning board meeting, just a few words, nothing that would alarm him, nothing that would invite questions I was not ready to answer. Then I drove, 53 minutes on Route 250, the fields still gray and flattened from the storm. The sky was the pale, washed-out color that comes after a hard rain, and the clouds were still low and heavy, as if the storm had not quite decided whether it was done with us yet. The road was scattered with branches and debris, and I had to slow down twice to navigate around fallen trees that had not yet been cleared. But I did not mind the delays because I did not want to arrive yet. I wanted to stay in the moving car for a little while longer where I could pretend that nothing had changed, that the world was still the same world it had been when I went to sleep. On the way, I called a landscape restoration company I had used twice before for storm work on the property. They said they could have a crew out within the hour, and I told them to come. I did not tell them why I needed them because I did not know myself. I just knew that there was a hole in the ground where Margaret's oak tree had stood and that something was in that hole that I needed to see and that whatever it was going to change everything. Margaret had fallen asleep in this passenger seat more times than I could count. Had tipped back, completely unself-conscious in the way she was about everything that mattered, her mouth slightly open in the particular way of a woman who slept without apology because sleep was something she believed in. I used to reach over and turn the radio down without her asking, not because the music bothered her, but because I wanted to preserve the quiet around her, to create a small bubble of peace that the world could not intrude upon. She never thanked me for it, she just kept sleeping. He thought about all the mornings we had driven this road together, to Charlottesville for appointments, to the hardware store for supplies, to the farm when we were still living in the city and the weekend was the only time we could get away. She would always be the one who noticed the details. The way the light fell across a particular field, the color of the leaves turning in the fall, the hawks circling above the highway looking for something to eat. She had a capacity for attention that I had never been able to match, a way of seeing the world that made ordinary things seem extraordinary simply because she was looking at them. And now I was driving this road alone, watching the gray fields pass by the window, and I was trying to prepare myself for something I did not know how to prepare for. The farm looked different in the early morning light. He had driven this lane in every season and every hour, summer evenings when the sun hung low and golden, winter mornings when the frost lay thick and white on every surface, spring afternoons when the dogwoods were blooming and the world seemed to be starting over again. But the light after a storm has a particular quality that is different from all of those, the light of something that has been through a trial and come out the other side, cleansed, perhaps, or simply stripped down to its essentials. The oak lay across the rose bed like something that had surrendered rather than fallen, its root ball rising from the earth taller than I was, a monument to what had been taken. The north fence was gone, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. The irrigation line ran across the mud in broken sections, twisted and torn in ways that would take weeks to repair. And everywhere, there was the smell of turned earth, the particular, earthy, almost sweet smell of soil that had been brought up from deep underground, soil that had not seen the light in decades. He got out of the truck and stood there for a moment, not moving, just letting it all register. The air was cold and wet and smelled of broken things. The garden that Margaret had spent years nurturing was a wreck, a chaos of mud and splintered wood and uprooted plants. And in the middle of it all, standing at the edge of the hole the storm had opened, was Carol. She turned to face me when she heard the truck door close, and she had been standing there for a while, I could tell. Her jacket was wet with the water that was still dripping from the trees, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. M.R. Bennett, she said, her voice the same careful, steady voice it had been on the phone, the voice of a woman who had decided that she was going to hold herself together even if it killed her. Look at what's in the hole. He walked to the edge and looked down, and there it was. A steel box wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting and bound with electrical tape that had gone stiff with age, sitting cradled between two severed roots as if the tree had been holding it all these years and had only just now given it up. Someone had sealed it with the care of a person who intended it to last a very long time in the ground. Not the careless sealing of someone who was trying to hide something quickly, but the deliberate, unhurried sealing of someone who understood that this thing was meant to survive. On the lid, scratched into the metal by hand, not engraved by machine, carved letter by careful letter with a tool and absolute intention, were two words, Richard. Open this alone. My legs went unsteady beneath me, not from weakness. I had been standing on my own 2 feet for 73 years and had never once fallen. But from the recognition. The slight forward lean of the capital R, the deliberate care of each letter, the way the hand that had made them had moved slowly and carefully because this was important and could not be rushed. The unmistakable signature of a woman who believed that how you wrote something said as much as what you wrote. Carol, I said, and my voice came out steady, which surprised me. Give everyone the morning off. She nodded once, her expression unchanged, and walked toward the barn without another word. He stood at the edge of that hole, and I looked down at what my wife had buried beneath her oak tree, and then I climbed down into the earth to get it. The box weighed more than I expected, not from its contents, I would learn those soon enough, but from the particular heaviness that settles into an object when someone has handled it with deliberate, unhurried purpose. It was the weight of intention, the weight of a thing that had been created with care and wrapped with care and buried with care. Because the person who had done all of those things had wanted it to be found someday and had wanted it to be found exactly as they had left it. Margaret had sealed this the way she did everything she considered permanent, 3 layers of heavy-gauge plastic, each layer taped independently before the next went on. Not because she thought the first layer would fail, but because she believed in redundancy, in backups, in the principle that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing well enough that you would not have to do it again. She had not been careless about this, she had not been careless about anything. He carried the box across the garden and up the porch steps, my boots squelching in the mud, my breath coming hard from the effort of holding something that was not just physically heavy but emotionally weighted beyond measure. The porch creaked under my feet the way it always had, the same creak it had made when we first moved in, and I had told Margaret we needed to replace the boards and she had said, "No, Richard, I like the way it sounds. It tells you that the house is still alive." Carol was at the kitchen door when I came up the steps, a dish towel turning over and over in her hands without her seeming to notice. She had the kettle on behind her, I could see, and 2 mugs set out on the counter, one for me, one for her, because she had known I would need something warm and had prepared it without being asked. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked, her voice careful, the voice of a woman who understood that she was standing at the edge of something she had not been invited into and who was asking for permission because she respected the boundaries even though she wanted to be there. "No," I said. "Thank you, Carol. Give me the morning." She looked at the box once, not prying, just recognizing something she had been wondering about for a long time. Then set the dish towel on the counter and walked out through the side door, closing it softly behind her. I sat at the kitchen table, Margaret's table. Being it from a Waynesboro estate sale, refinished by her own hands over 2 weekends our first autumn together, scarred with 30 years of coffee rings and garden catalogs and the marks of a woman who believed tables existed to be used. She had stripped the old varnish off herself, sanding until the wood was smooth again, and then she had oiled it with something she had mixed herself from linseed and beeswax and a few other ingredients she would never tell me about because she said a woman needed to keep a few secrets from her husband. He sat there with the box in front of me, and I did not open it right away. I just sat there looking at it, breathing in the smells of the kitchen. The familiar, comfortable smells of a house that had been a home for a very long time, and I let myself feel everything I had been holding at bay for 3 years. I thought about Margaret's hands, the way they had looked when she was working in the garden. They had been strong hands, capable hands, the hands of a woman who was not afraid of hard work, calloused and rough and often dirty. And she had never once been embarrassed by them because she had always said that clean hands were the sign of a woman who had never done anything worthwhile. He thought about the way she had laughed, the particular sound of it, the way it had filled up whatever room she was in and made everyone around her smile, even people who did not know her. Her laugh had been so big, so generous, so completely without self-consciousness. She had laughed the way she did everything else, fully, completely, without holding anything back. He thought about the last time I had seen her alive, the night before she died, when she had been sitting in this kitchen at this table drinking tea and looking out the window at the garden, and she had said, "Richard, I think I've done everything I needed to do." And I had told her not to talk like that she had years and years left, that the doctors were wrong about everything anyway. And she had just smiled at me with that particular smile she had, the one that said she understood something I did not, and she had reached across the table and taken my hand and held it until I stopped talking. He had not understood what she was trying to tell me then, but I understood now that I reached into my pocket for my knife and cut through the plastic. It came away in strips, the tape cracking and separating with a sound that was somewhere between a snap and a sigh. The steel underneath was cold and slightly damp, but sound, the kind of solid, well-made sound that spoke of quality and care. On the lid, the scratched letters were clearer now, without the plastic obscuring them, "Richard. Open this alone." There had that slight forward lean she always gave it. A quirk of her handwriting that I had noticed on the first note she ever left me and that I had loved ever since without ever telling her. Because it was the kind of detail that only a person who had paid attention over a very long time would have noticed, and I had noticed it because I had paid attention to her. My chest hurt so badly I had to press my hand flat against my sternum and breathe through it. Slow and deliberate, the way the cardiac surgeon had taught me after the surgery 4 years ago, in through the nose, out through the mouth, counting each breath, letting the pain move through me without fighting it. He opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oil cloth that had been folded with the same care Margaret brought to everything, the edges crisp and straight, the corners perfectly matched, were several things. A letter on cream stationery folded in thirds, the paper soft with handling, a green composition notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for $1.50, but this one had been handled with such care that it was still in excellent condition, bank statements clipped in chronological order, the paper clips still holding them together exactly as she had arranged them. Invoices from gambling establishments printed to look like something else, the kind of documents that were designed to look legitimate at a glance but that fell apart under the slightest scrutiny, loan documents, the kind you signed when you had run out of other options and did not care what the terms were because you needed the money right now, and beneath all of it, internal documents bearing a header I recognized immediately, Bennett Agricultural Supply. My hands were trembling as I unfolded the letter, not the fine tremor of age. I had been dealing with that for years without it bothering me, but the deep shaking of a man whose body understood something his mind was still refusing, the kind of shaking that comes not from weakness but from the sheer weight of what is about to be faced. She wrote plainly, the way she always wrote when she had run out of better options, the way she wrote when she had stopped trying to soften things and had decided that the truth needed to be told whether it was comfortable or not. The letter began, "My dearest Richard," and just those 3 words made my throat tighten because I could hear her voice saying them, could see the way her eyes would soften when she spoke to me in that particular tone, the tone she used only when she was about to say something that came from the deepest part of her. "If you are reading this, then the oak has come down and you have found what I buried beneath it. I am sorry that you have to find it this way. I had hoped I would be able to tell you myself, but I am writing this in the fall of my last year and I know now that I may not have the chance. I need you to know that I did not keep this from you because I did not trust you. I kept it from you because I was trying to protect you. You were 3 weeks out of cardiac surgery when I found the first discrepancy, and I had just received my own diagnosis. I knew that if I told you what I had found, you would try to fix it, and that the stress of trying to fix it would undo all the progress you had made. I could not bear the thought of losing you to the same thing that was taking me, and so I made a choice that I am not entirely sure was the right one. I chose to carry this alone." The letter went on to explain everything Margaret had discovered over those 14 months of careful investigation. She had found the first evidence of Daniel's theft in the company's accounting records, a small discrepancy that would have been easy to overlook if you were not looking for it, but Margaret had always been the kind of woman who noticed the details that other people missed. She had spent 8 months verifying what she had found, cross-referencing numbers, calling vendors, tracking paper trails through the maze of shell companies and consulting firms that Daniel had set up to obscure his activities. She had documented everything with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that the difference between a problem and a disaster was usually just a matter of how long it went unexamined. And she had buried it all beneath the oak tree because she did not know where else to put it. She could not trust the company's lawyer because he was Daniel's lawyer too. She could not trust a safe deposit box because the access records could be seen, and she could not tell me because she was trying to protect me from the stress while I recovered from surgery. The tree, she wrote, was the only option that belonged to no one but her, the only place she could put something that she needed to survive her. And she had believed the tree would stand long enough. She had not counted on a storm that exceptional. Or maybe she had understood in the way she understood things without articulating them that the right storm would come eventually, and that eventually was close enough to trust. He set the letter down with both hands because I could not trust one. My face was wet. Somewhere in the last paragraph, I had started to cry, not the managed grief I had learned to carry, but something raw, something from a place I had not known was still this open. My shoulders were shaking. He pressed my hand against my mouth and breathed and told myself there was work to do. I wiped my face with Carol's dish towel. He opened the composition notebook to the first page. The handwriting was Margaret's, the careful cursive she used when she was writing something that mattered. The date was March 14th. The entry read simply, Daniel, $847,000. Fierce discrepancy found in consulting firm invoices. Need to trace further. I turned the page, and the next entry was dated March 17th, and it detailed another $312,000 in payments to a different consulting firm. He kept turning pages, and with each page I felt something in my chest grow heavier and colder. 83 pages of documentation, 14 months of work, all of it detailing the systematic theft of my company by my own son. And at the bottom of the last entry, in handwriting that was shakier than the rest because she was getting sicker by then, she had written, Richard will need to finish what I started. I trust him to do what is right. My phone rang. The screen read Daniel. I have answered the phone in the middle of crisis before. In 40 years of running a business, I have learned that the first thing you do when the phone rings with bad news is breathe before you speak, because the tone of your voice in the first 10 seconds sets the temperature of everything that follows. He picked up the phone. He breathed. Daniel, I said. Dad. His voice carried the particular quality I had learned over 38 years to recognize, controlled urgency, the voice of someone managing something serious without tipping into panic. He had learned that from me. He was no longer certain how I felt about having taught it. We have a situation with the Meridian shipment. CBP flagged the manifest last night, secondary review, Port of Baltimore. The whole container is sitting in the Federal Examination Facility. He looked down at the composition notebook still open on the table. Daniel's name, the date, $847,000. Go on, I said. The delivery penalty clause kicks in after 72 hours. We're at hour 19. He paused just long enough. We need to post $3 million as a customs bond to stop the clock. eBay already drawn up the paperwork. The farm is the cleanest collateral we have. If you sign tonight, I can have funds posted by 9. The farm. Margaret's farm. The property where not 40 minutes ago I had climbed into the earth to retrieve what she had left me. My hand tightened around the phone until I felt the case flex against my palm. He kept my voice easy. What about Frank? He asked. Frank Dahl had been my chief financial officer for 35 years. No financial commitment of this size had ever moved without his direct sign-off. If this customs hold was legitimate, Frank would have called me first. Frank's been looped in, Daniel said too quickly. Not Frank called me, not Frank confirmed, just a passive unverifiable claim. He pressed my back teeth together and kept my voice easy. Walk me through the customs bond account, I said. The specific account the funds go to. It's a holding account through the brokerage firm managing the release, he said. Garrett Shaw set it up. He's been handling the legal side since last night. Garrett Shaw. He did not recognize the name, but I filed it away with the careful attention of a man who had learned that unrecognized names were sometimes the most important ones. 3 things were wrong. First, CBP escrow accounts were federal government accounts with a specific routing format administered through licensed customs brokers, not private consulting firms. Second, Frank had not called me, which meant either he did not know or he knew and was being prevented from raising concerns. Third, the farm was held in my name alone after probate. Daniel had no legal authority to prepare collateral documents against it without my prior agreement. He did not say any of this. "Bring the paperwork tonight," I said. "I'll be here." "Dad, the timeline," "I understand the timeline, Daniel." Used the threat of steel, not enough to alarm him. "Drive safe." He ended the call. He pressed both palms flat against Margaret's table and breathed through my nose for 10 slow seconds. My heart was not racing. It was beating with the heavy deliberateness of a clock that understood it had important work ahead. He read the notebook for 12 minutes. Then I called Frank Dahl. He answered on the first ring. "Frank," I said, "archive room side entrance." "Don't log the visit." 3 seconds of silence. 15 minutes, Frank said. The notebook had 116 pages. Margaret had used 83 of them. I know the exact numbers because I counted without meaning to. Some part of my brain that had been running a business for 4 decades kept tallying automatically even when the rest of me was somewhere else entirely. 83 pages, 14 months of work. Every entry dated, every figure cross-referenced, every discrepancy traced back to its source with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that the difference between a problem and a disaster was usually just a matter of how long it went unexamined. My wife had been dying, and she had spent 14 months building a case. The first entries were written in her ordinary cursive, the relaxed handwriting she used for grocery lists and garden notes, as if she had not yet decided whether what she was seeing was significant enough to warrant her careful script. By the 4th entry, the handwriting had changed, smaller, more deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had decided this matter. Daniel had been routing inventory through 4 consulting firms, each registered to a different name, all operating from mail forwarding addresses in Northern Virginia. The money moved in amounts small enough to avoid automatic review thresholds. The invoices described services big enough to pass a casual audit, market analysis, logistics optimization, but Margaret had pulled every one of them. She had called 2 of the forwarding services directly, posing as a vendor, confirming delivery addresses. She had cross-referenced registration dates against payment dates. Every firm had been registered within 60 days of its first invoice to Bennett Agricultural Supply. Every firm had stopped filing annual reports within 18 months of its last payment. My hands were trembling. Not the earlier shaking of grief, but something colder, the tremor of a man reading something he understood and wished in some part of himself he could not entirely suppress that he could stop understanding. June Septimo found the first sports betting record. 14 separate transactions over 6 months. Total outflow $312,000. The account was replenished each time within 2 to 3 weeks from the consulting firm payments. He's been cycling it. I pushed back from the table so hard the chair scraped against the floor. He walked to the back door and stood on the porch with both hands gripping the railing, my chest heaving in a way that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with the fact that I had just read a sentence my wife had written about my son in her handwriting in a notebook she had buried in the ground because she did not know what else to do with it. M.R. Bennett. Carol was standing on the garden path with 2 mugs of coffee, her barn jacket zipped against the October chill. She had not asked if I wanted one. She had simply brought two, which told me everything I needed to know about what she had read in my face. She set one on the railing beside my hand and looked out at the fallen oak lying across the ruined rose bed. She used to come out here early, Carol said quietly. The autumn before she got really sick. 5:30 in the morning. I'd see the kitchen light, and then she'd go out with her notebook. He never asked what she was writing. She paused. I figured it was her business. My eyes burned. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way Margaret used to wrap her hands around things when she was thinking, as if warmth itself were a form of clarity. She was the most capable person I have ever known, I said. My voice broke slightly on the last word. He pressed my lips together and let the moment pass. He did not tell her that enough. Carol looked at me with eyes that were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She knew, she said with the quiet certainty of a woman who had watched a marriage from close range for 18 years. Mr. Bennett, she knew. He finished the coffee and went back inside. The last entry Margaret had written before the handwriting became too unsteady to continue was dated November 3rd. There is one name that keeps appearing at the edges of the larger transactions that I haven't been able to fully trace, Garrett Shaw. He's listed as legal counsel on two of the consulting firm registrations. Wherever the money gets complicated, his name is nearby. Richard will need to find out what I couldn't. He closed the notebook. Garrett Shaw, the same name Daniel had given me 40 minutes ago, the lawyer managing the customs dispute, the man setting up the wire transfer account. The name Margaret had flagged in the last coherent entry she ever wrote. My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. He picked up my keys from the hook by the kitchen door. The hook Margaret had installed our first month on the property because she said a house where people were always searching for their keys was a house that had not yet decided to be organized. And I walked out to my truck. I had a 15-minute appointment with Frank Doyle that I did not intend to be late for. I had not used the chairman's entrance in 4 years. It was not a secret exactly. Everyone on the executive floor knew it existed, but it was the kind of thing that existed without being discussed, the way certain arrangements in long-running organizations exist because they made sense once and nobody has found a reason to undo them. A private elevator in the parking structure sublevel, accessible only by a key card that had never been integrated into the building's main access system because it predated the main access system by a decade. The card lived on a ring with 3 others in the breast pocket of my everyday jacket, and I had not thought about it in years. Daniel had never asked about it. He had never offered. He badged in at 9. 24 pulgadas the morning and rode the elevator up to the 4th floor without passing through the lobby, without crossing in front of the reception desk, without appearing on a single camera that fed into the building's standard monitoring system. He had called building security from the truck on the way in. A man named Hector who had worked our overnight rotation for 11 years and who, when I explained that I needed this particular morning's visit kept out of the access logs until further notice, said, "Yes, Sir, Mr. Bennett," in the tone of a man who had been trusted with things before and understood what the trust required. Frank was already in the archive room when I got there. He had pulled the door closed behind him and turned on only the secondary lighting. The low, workmanlike fluorescence along the shelving units rather than the overhead panels. And he was standing at the central table with a stack of printed documents in front of him and an expression on his face that I had seen only twice before in 35 years. Once when a supplier had defrauded us out of $200,000 in the early 90s, once when the market collapsed in 2008 and we had to restructure 3 lines of credit in 10 days. It was the expression Frank wore when something was seriously wrong, and he had known it was seriously wrong before he was in a position to say so. "You already knew," I said. It was not an accusation. It was a recognition. Frank set both hands flat on the table and looked at me with the directness of a man who had decided somewhere between my phone call and this moment that there was no version of this conversation that benefited from anything less than complete honesty. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "I did not know the shape of it. I have been looking at numbers that didn't reconcile for the past 2 quarters, and every time I tried to trace the discrepancy it disappeared into the consulting firm invoices." His jaw was tight. "I was building a report. He was going to bring it to you when I had enough to show you something concrete rather than a collection of anomalies that Daniel could explain away as accounting variance." He stopped and looked at the table. "He should have come to you sooner." "You're here now," I said. "Tell me what you found." Frank turned over the first document on the stack. "The building's monitoring system for Warehouse 3 was disabled at 11:47 last night," he said, pointing to a printout that showed a gap in the camera feed. "Not a malfunction, not a power interruption, but a clean, deliberate deactivation that lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes before being restored. That's our primary storage for the Meridian shipment inventory. The restoration happened at 4:12 this morning, approximately 40 minutes before the storm damage would have been visible enough to draw attention." He moved to the second document. "Your access credentials to the freight management system were restricted at 6:15 this morning. The restriction was applied by Daniel's administrator account." My stomach dropped about 6 inches. Note that the information itself. He had suspected something of this magnitude since I read the 3rd page of Margaret's notebook, but at the confirmation. Suspicion and confirmation were different countries, and the border crossing between them was not comfortable. "What else?" he said. Frank hesitated just a fraction of a second, the hesitation of a man about to say something he had been carrying for too long. 3 weeks ago," he said carefully, "Daniel filed a transfer of record with the Secretary of State's office in Delaware. A new holding company, Bennett Agricultural Holdings, LLC, registered in Wilmington. He transferred a partial interest in the company's operating assets into it. The transfer was structured as a reorganization for tax efficiency purposes." He looked up at me. The paperwork crossed my desk for review. He flagged it to Daniel and asked him to hold until we could discuss the tax implications. "He told me you had already approved it verbally and that he would follow up with documentation." Frank's voice stayed level, but something behind his eyes was working hard to stay that way. "The documentation never came. He should have pushed harder. He did not push hard enough." Frank's voice was heavy with regret as he stood in the archive room, his hands still flat on the table. "I told myself I was being thorough, that I needed more evidence before I could bring it to you. But the truth is, I didn't want to believe it. I have known Daniel since he was a boy. I watched him grow up. I taught him how to read a balance sheet. And I could not make myself see what was right in front of me." He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw something I had not expected, not just professional regret, but genuine grief. "Richard, I am sorry. I should have come to you sooner, and I did not, and that failure is mine to carry." He reached across the table and put my hand on his shoulder. "Frank, you are here now. You brought this to me. That is what matters. There will be time for the rest of it later." He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting absolution he was not sure he deserved, and then he turned back to the documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had just been reminded what his job was. "There is more," he said, pulling out another stack of papers. "I called Marcus Webb before you arrived." He did not tell him why. He just told him I needed him here. A is pulling into the parking structure now. Marcus Webb had been the company's outside counsel for 22 years. A was 52 years old, thin in the way of men who forgot to eat when they were thinking, and he had the particular quality of stillness that came from spending 2 decades in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment cost people everything they had built. A did not panic. A did not speculate. He identified what the law required and he pursued it with a thoroughness that had saved us from 4 disputes I had not even realized were disputes until he explained them to me afterward. He walked into the archive room 40 seconds later with his laptop bag over one shoulder and his reading glasses already on, and he looked at me and he looked at Frank and he looked at the stack of documents on the table and he said, "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning and do not leave anything out." He told him everything. It took 11 minutes. Marcus did not interrupt once. He sat at the corner of the table with a legal pad in front of him and wrote in the compressed shorthand he used when information was coming faster than ordinary notes could capture it. And when I finished, he set his pen down and was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, the silence of a man running calculations, not a man at a loss for words. "The Delaware transfer is the most urgent problem," he said. "If Daniel activates that dispute mechanism before we can freeze it, we lose the ability to act quickly. He can file for a temporary restraining order in federal court, and TRO. A duty judge can review the application within 48 hours if we can demonstrate imminent and irreparable harm. Given what you have in that notebook and what Frank has in those documents, I believe we can make that case." 48 hours, I said. "Possibly less," Marcus said. "Depending on the duty judge and how clearly we can document the fraudulent intent behind the transfer. The Uniform Voidable Transactions Act as adopted in Virginia allows us to argue that the transfer was made in anticipation of litigation and should be voided. That argument is strong here." He looked at me over his glasses. "But Richard, this is not just a civil matter. What you have described is wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Those are federal crimes, each carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years. This needs to go to the FBI." The word landed in the archive room like something physical. He looked at Frank. Frank looked at me with the expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to say that word out loud and was not relieved to hear it, but was glad it had been said. "Make the call," I told Marcus. Marcus was already reaching for his phone. Frank turned back to the freight management system printout and set his finger on a line near the bottom of the page, the departure record for the Meridian container. He looked up at me, and the expression on his face told me what he had found before he said a single word. "Richard," he said quietly, "the ship hasn't left port. The container is still in the originating facility in Rotterdam. It hasn't cleared Dutch customs yet." The air went out of the room. "There's no customs hold," I said. "There is no customs hold," Frank confirmed. "There is no CBP examination. There is no penalty clock." His voice was steady and careful and absolutely precise. "The shipment Daniel described to you this morning does not exist in its current form. He manufactured the entire scenario." He sat down in the nearest chair because my legs had decided without consulting me that standing was no longer something they were willing to commit to. I pressed my hand over my mouth and breathed through my nose and looked at the freight management printout and thought about my son's voice on the phone that morning, the controlled urgency, the practiced smoothness, the way he had set standard procedure and trusted that I would not look too closely. He had built a company on looking closely. My phone buzzed again. He took it out of my pocket and looked at the screen. The text was from Carol. Daniel just called the office asking where you are. He told him you were at the farm. He asked if you had opened anything from the storm cleanup. My jaw went rigid. My hand tightened on the phone until the knuckles went white. He knew about the box. Not specifically, not yet, but he was afraid. He had been afraid since the storm came through last night. Afraid since the moment he understood that the oak tree had come down because he had spent 3 years wondering whether that tree was hiding something. And last night the storm had answered the question for him. He had built this entire scenario in a single night. I tapped back to Carol. Tell him I'm resting. Don't mention anything else. Then I looked up at Marcus, who was still on the phone with his hand pressed to his other ear, and I said, we need to move faster than 48 hours. Marcus met my eyes. I know, he said. I'm working on it. Marcus Webb was on the phone for 22 minutes. He knew because I watched the clock on the archive room wall the entire time he was talking, not because I was impatient, but because my mind needed something concrete to hold on to while the rest of it processed what Frank was continuing to find in the freight management records. The second hand moved. He breathed. Frank printed documents and set them in order on the table with the methodical care of a man who understood that the difference between evidence and paper was organization. At the 17-minute mark, Marcus walked to the far corner of the room and lowered his voice. At the 19-minute mark, he said the words Garrett Shaw, and I watched his posture change, a small shift, almost imperceptible. The shift of a man who has just been told that the door he thought he was opening had actually been open for some time already, waiting for him. He ended the call at 22 minutes and came back to the table. Special Agent Karen Lowe is 40 minutes out, he said. She runs the Financial Crimes Unit out of the Richmond field office. She knows Garrett Shaw's name. He set his phone down on the table with a precision that told me this information was more significant than his tone let on. She has known it for 14 months. Frank looked up from the documents. He felt something move through my chest that was not quite relief and not quite dread, but contained elements of both. The sensation of learning that the problem you thought was contained had roots that went considerably deeper than you had been prepared to find. 14 months, I said. The Bureau has been building a case against an organized lending network operating across Virginia and Maryland, Marcus said. He pulled out his legal pad and began writing as he spoke, the way he always did when he was thinking in real time and needed the words in front of him to stay precise. They believe the network has been operating for at least 6 years. They have identified several individuals who borrowed from it under financial duress, gambling debts, failed investments, the kind of situations where people make decisions they would not otherwise make because they have run out of other options. Garrett Shaw appears in the network structure as a connector. He identifies distressed borrowers, facilitates the initial loans, and then assists in structuring financial arrangements that obscure the money trail. Marcus looked up at me. Agent Lowe said that when I mentioned Daniel's name, she recognized it. He appears in their investigative records as a probable borrower. The room was very quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights along the shelving units. My son had not just been stealing from our company to feed a gambling habit. He had gotten into debt with people who were the subject of a 14-month FBI investigation. And at some point in the last 6 years, Garrett Shaw had found him and handed him a shovel and watched him dig. "Tell me about the shipment," I said. "The Meridian container, all of it." Frank set a new document on the table, 2 contracts side by side, both bearing the Bennett Agricultural Supply letterhead in the header. It pointed to the first one. "This is the legitimate Meridian contract," he said. "Signed 8 months ago, $12 million for a full container of precision irrigation equipment destined for a farming cooperative in the Central Valley of California. Or standard terms, 60 days net, payment delivery, penalty clause, the works." He moved his finger to the second document. "This is a second contract for the same container. Different buyer. A company called Pacific Agro Distribution, registered in Nevada 3 months ago, different terms, different delivery address." He looked at me. "Same equipment, same container, same ship." He stared at the 2 contracts. "He sold it twice," I said. "He sold it twice," Frank confirmed. His voice was careful and flat, the voice of a man delivering information he would very much have preferred not to be delivering. "The plan, as best as we can reconstruct it, works like this." He straightened up and spoke slowly, the way he did when he was explaining something to a board that needed to understand it clearly rather than technically. "When the container arrives at the port of Baltimore next month, Daniel's intention was to divert it to a private warehouse facility in Maryland, one of 3 facilities we have identified in the freight records that are not part of our normal distribution network. The equipment goes to Pacific Agro Distribution, who has already paid for it. Meanwhile, Daniel files a report with our insurance carrier stating that the container was seized by federal authorities due to a customs dispute, the same fictional customs dispute he presented to you this morning. Bennett Agricultural Supply collects the insurance payout. The Meridian Cooperative, who has also already paid, receives nothing and files suit against us. We are left holding a $12 million liability and insurance fraud exposure and a lawsuit from a California farming cooperative while Daniel is," Frank paused. "While Daniel is somewhere that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States." He pressed both hands flat against the table. The physical sensation was deliberate. He needed to feel something solid beneath my palms, needed the resistance of the pine surface against my skin to remind me that the floor was still there and I was still standing on it, because the alternative was to let my legs do what they had been threatening to do for the past 10 minutes, which was give out entirely. "The $3 million he asked me to wire this morning," I said. "That was not for a customs bond." "No," Frank said. "Based on Agent Lowe's preliminary assessment, it appears to be a debt payment to the lending network. The amount matches a figure that appears in their investigative records as a pending obligation tied to an individual matching Daniel's profile." He stopped and swallowed. "He needed your signature on the farm collateral to secure the wire, and he needed the wire to clear before the ship arrived and the scheme became visible. The whole customs emergency was designed to create a window. Panic you into signing before you had time to think." I thought about Daniel's voice on the phone that morning, the controlled urgency, the practiced smoothness. He had been up all night building this. The storm had knocked down an 80-year-old oak tree, and my son had sat somewhere in the dark and in less than 8 hours constructed an entire fictional crisis designed to move $3 million out of our company and into the hands of people I had never heard of before. Marcus said the words organized lending network 40 minutes ago. I was aware that my jaw was aching. He had been clenching it for some time. "The farm," I said. "He needed the farm specifically." Marcus nodded. "2 reasons, we believe. First, it is a clean asset, Clear title, no existing encumbrances, appraised at well above the 3 million he needed. Quick to secure, quick to release. A hesitated just a fraction. Second, we believe he also wanted to remove it from your control. The farm is the one significant asset entirely outside the company's structure. If he could tie it up in collateral and then trigger a default by ensuring the customs bond was never returned, because there was no customs bond, there was never going to be a return, he would have effectively stripped it from you through paperwork rather than direct action. Margaret's farm. Margaret's rose garden. Margaret's oak tree, which had stood for 80 years and come down last night in a storm and given up what it had been keeping. He thought about my wife sitting in that garden in the dark at 5 in the morning, writing in a composition notebook while the cancer was doing what it was doing, and the man she was writing about was asleep somewhere, not knowing she was watching. He thought about the 3 layers of waterproof plastic. He thought about the way she had scratched those letters into the metal lid with her own hands because she wanted to make absolutely sure I could not mistake who had left it. My eyes burned so severely that I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. "All right," I said when I trusted my voice again. "Ejemplo is 40 minutes out. What do we need to have ready when she arrives?" Marcus was already writing. Frank was already printing. And somewhere across the city in an office that had my name on the door and my father's photograph on the wall, my son was waiting for an old man to do what old men did, trust the people they had raised and sign the paper put in front of them. He did not know that I had his mother's notebook. He did not know that I had 40 minutes. The phone rang at 11:07. He knew it was Daniel before I looked at the screen. Not because I expected him, but because there are calls you feel coming the way you feel a change in weather, a shift in pressure that arrives before any visible sign. He had felt it for the past 20 minutes, the low certainty that the morning had not finished with me yet. He looked at the screen. Daniel. He picked up on the second ring. "Daniel," I said. "Dad." His voice had changed. That was the first thing I noticed. Not what he said, but the quality of the silence underneath the word, the texture of it. This morning, he had called me with controlled urgency, the voice of someone managing a crisis he had manufactured and needed me to accept as genuine. This was different. This was the voice of a man who had been doing calculations and did not like what they were adding up to, flat, careful, the voice of someone trying to determine what you know without revealing what they are afraid you might know. "Where are you?" he asked. 3 words. No preamble, no follow-up on the customs situation, no mention of the paperwork he was supposedly preparing to bring to the farm tonight. Used "where are you?" He looked at Frank. Frank looked at me. Neither of us moved. I moved to the monitoring terminal at the end of the archive room, a secondary display that gave access to the building's internal camera feeds, and pulled up the executive floor. The image was grainy in the way of cameras that were purchased for coverage rather than resolution, but it was clear enough. The door to my office, the one with my name on the glass and my father's photograph on the wall and 35 years of decisions made at the desk inside, was open. Standing in front of my desk, one hand resting on the surface with the proprietary ease of a man who had decided the room already belonged to him, was my son. On the desk in front of him, open to a tabbed page, was the manila envelope I recognized from Margaret's estate filing, her will. My stomach turned over so completely that I had to press my hand flat against the monitoring terminal and hold myself there for a moment. Not from weakness, but from the sheer physical force of understanding something I had been circling for the past 3 hours and had now arrived at completely. A had been looking for the box for 3 years. He had searched the house, the outbuildings, the filing cabinets, the safe in the study that Margaret had kept locked and that he did not have the combination to. A had even suggested selling the farm twice in the past 2 years, once when I was recovering from the surgery, once 6 months after Margaret died. Both times I had said no without explaining why the answer was no. Both times he had accepted it without pushing. He understood now that he had not been pushing because he had not yet found what he was looking for. And selling without finding it would have meant losing the chance forever. And he had told himself that maybe there was nothing to find, that maybe his mother had decided to let it go, that maybe the silence meant safety. And then last night a storm had come through and taken down an 80-year-old oak tree, and he had understood that the silence had not meant safety at all. It had meant the ground was not ready to give up what it was keeping. He had built a $3 million escape plan in less than 8 hours, and now he was standing in my office reading my dead wife's will, looking for confirmation of something he needed to know before tonight. "I'm at the farm," I said. My voice came out exactly as I needed it to, steady, slightly tired, the voice of a man who had spent the morning dealing with storm damage and was resting before his son arrived for dinner. "The cleanup is taking longer than I expected. He was going to call you." "Have you?" He stopped. "Started again. Did the storm do much damage to the garden?" "Not. How are you?" "Not. Did you eat?" "Not. I will help when I get there." "The garden." He wanted to know about the garden, which meant he wanted to know about the tree, which meant he wanted to know what the tree had given up when it fell. "It is a mess," I said. "The old oak came down. Took most of the rose bed with it." A pause. 2 seconds. 3. "That is too bad," he said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man producing words he needed to say rather than words he was actually feeling. Did anyone do anything with the cleanup yet?" "Carol sent the crew home for the morning," I said. "We will deal with it this afternoon." "Why?" I want to make sure nobody disturbs anything before I get there tonight," he said. "Old trees like that sometimes have root systems that affect the drainage for the whole property. You want to take a look before anybody starts filling the hole." I wanted to take a look before anybody started filling the hole. My hand tightened on the phone so hard that the knuckle of my index finger went white and then numb. He kept my voice easy. He kept my voice, the voice of a father who trusted his son. "Of course," I said. "Carol will not touch it until you have had a chance to look." "What time should I expect you?" "7," he said. "Maybe earlier." "I will be here," I said. "Drive safe." He ended the call. For a moment, I just stood there with the phone in my hand and the camera feed showing my son replacing the will document in the manila envelope with the practiced care of a man who needed no evidence of his visit to remain. And I felt something move through me that was not grief and was not rage, but was something older and heavier than either. The particular pain of watching someone you raised become someone you do not recognize, and the understanding that the distance between those two people was not a sudden fall but a long slow walk that you had somehow not seen happening. "He knows," I said. "Not specifically, but he knows the tree came down and he is afraid of what that means." "The flat," Frank said quietly. He turned. Frank had his phone out and was reading from the screen. He had pulled up the airline booking system through the company travel account that Daniel used for business trips. "American Airlines Flight 1247 departing Richmond at 6:15 tomorrow morning," he said. "Connecting in Miami to a Copa Airlines flight departing at 11:40. Final destination Cancun. He set the phone down on the table with a gentleness that was somehow worse than if he had put it down hard. No return booking. No return booking. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Marcus Webb walked in at that moment. He had been in the hallway on a second call, and he read the room in approximately 3 seconds, the way he always read rooms quickly and completely, and he set his laptop bag on the table and said, "Agent Lowe is 12 minutes out. Tell me what happened." I told him about the call, about the garden, about the hole in the ground. Marcus listened without moving. When I finished, he said, "He is accelerating the timeline. I plan to leave tomorrow morning regardless of tonight. The flight confirms that. But the storm has made him nervous about what you might find before he can get the money and get out." He pulled out his legal pad. "This changes our preparation. We need to move the evening meeting forward if possible, or at minimum ensure that whatever happens tonight is structured to capture his admission before he has any reason to leave the table." "The paperwork switch," I said. "Yes," Marcus said. It was already writing. The substituted documents need to be in place before he arrives. The consent to record needs to be signed today. In Virginia, a property owner can record all conversations taking place on their own premises without disclosing the recording to other parties. It is called one-party consent. And it means that anything Daniel says tonight in your kitchen, in your living room, in your garden is legally admissible without his knowledge. We will need Carol to confirm the farm security cameras are operational. And we need the archive room door open. Special Agent Karen Lowe was not what I had expected. And then immediately she was exactly what I should have expected. She was in her early 50s with short gray hair and the kind of posture that came not from military training but from spending decades in rooms where how you held yourself determined whether people took you seriously. She wore a dark blazer and carried a leather portfolio that she set on the table without ceremony, and she looked at me with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had been doing this long enough to form accurate impressions quickly and waste very little time revising them. "Amy Bennett," she said, "I am sorry about your wife." She said it simply, without the rehearsed sympathy some people brought to condolences, and because of that it landed more heavily than expected. I knew Margaret was ill when her name first appeared in our records. I did not know she was building a parallel case. She did not know she was building one either, I said. She thought she was protecting me. Agent Lowe held my gaze for a moment. "She did both," she said. Then she opened the portfolio and got to work. She laid out the Bureau's case structure in 8 minutes. Organized lending network, 6 years of documented activity, 14 identified borrowers across Virginia and Maryland, Garrett Shaw as the structural hub between the network's financial operators and the individuals they targeted. Daniel's name had appeared 11 months ago in a wire transfer record tied to a shell company in Delaware. Not Bennett Agricultural Supplies Delaware entity, a different one registered to a nominee director whose name appeared in 4 other investigations the Bureau was currently running. "When you bring us in tonight," she said, "we come as invited guests, not as law enforcement conducting a search. You sign a consent to record. You sign an invitation letter. And anything that happens in that house is covered under your authorization as the property owner. We will have 2 agents inside and 2 outside. We do not move until Daniel makes the admission, the specific account number, the specific amount, the specific timeline. That is what closes the wire fraud count beyond reasonable doubt." She looked at me across the table with the calm authority of a woman who had done this many times and understood what she was asking. Can you do that? Sit across from your son tonight and let him believe he is winning until he gives us what we need? I thought about Margaret's notebook. He thought about 83 pages of careful, dated, cross-referenced entries written by a dying woman at 5 in the morning. He thought about 3 layers of waterproof plastic and 2 words scratched into metal by hand. Jace, I said. I can do that. Ahintlo nodded once, not with satisfaction, but with the particular respect one professional extends to another who has just agreed to do something genuinely difficult. Then let us build the rest of tonight, she said. We worked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know the exact duration because Marcus logged every decision with a timestamp, not out of obsessive habit, but because he understood that what we were building in that archive room was not just a plan but a record, and that every step of the record needed to be demonstrably lawful before the first piece of it was put into motion. He had said that to me once years ago when we were navigating a supplier dispute that had threatened to become litigation. The difference between a trap and an ambush is documentation. An ambush can be challenged. A documented trap is just due diligence. It had been right then. It was right now. Agent Lowe sat at the head of the table with her portfolio open and her pen moving with the particular quality of focused efficiency that I had come to associate with people who did difficult things often enough that difficulty itself had become a kind of baseline, not comfortable, but familiar. She worked the way Marcus worked, which was to say she identified what was needed and pursued it without ornamentation. For problems, Marcus said, standing at the whiteboard Frank had rolled in from the conference room down the hall. We handle them in order. We do not move to the next one until the current one is solved. He wrote the number 1 on the board. The documents, he said. Daniel is bringing a collateral agreement and a corporate authorization form that contains the incapacity clause. Both documents are designed to transfer something, the farm, Richard's voting authority. Based on Richard's signature. We need to replace them with documents that look identical on the outside but function differently on the inside. He turned to face us. What Richard's signature will actually confirm on the substituted version is that Daniel personally presented these documents and personally requested the wire transfer to the specified account. It is not a transfer of assets. It is a witness statement of intent and instruction. Garrett Shaw prepared the originals, which means he understands what language the documents should contain. The substitution needs to be precise enough that Daniel does not notice the difference in the time he has to review them. How long will Daniel review them? Ahintlo asked. He will expect his father to read them slowly, I said. He has built the entire evening around the assumption that I am going to trust him and sign without understanding what I am signing. He will not be watching for substitution. He will be watching for hesitation. Then we give him hesitation, Marcus said. Controlled hesitation. Richard reads slowly. Asks 1 or 2 questions that a concerned but ultimately trusting father would ask. And signs. Daniel relaxes. Then Richard asks him to confirm the wire details aloud. He wrote the number 2 on the board. The Delaware entity, he said. Frank. Frank straightened up from the laptop he had been working at since the meeting began. He filed the TRO application 40 minutes ago through our Delaware Litigation Council, he said. Emergency basis. We are arguing fraudulent transfer under the Uniform Voidable Transactions Act and requesting an immediate freeze on the holding company's ability to execute any asset dispute claims pending resolution of the criminal investigation. I looked at Agent Lowe. Your case file gets attached to the application as supporting documentation. The duty judge in Wilmington has the filing. We should have a ruling within 48 hours, possibly less if the judge reviews it tonight. And if Daniel tries to trigger the dispute mechanism before the ruling comes through? He asked. He can file, Marcus said, but filing requires him to be present in a Delaware court or represented by local counsel. And if he is in custody tonight, he will not be doing either. He wrote the number 3. The accounts, he said. Frank. I have been on the phone with our primary bank contact since 11:30, Frank said. His voice was steady, but there were lines around his eyes that had not been there this morning, the lines of a man who had been running on coffee and adrenaline since before most people had finished their breakfast. All accounts that Daniel has sole signing authority over have been flagged for enhanced review. Any wire transfer request above $10,000 will require secondary authorization from me or from Richard before it processes. That flagging is in place as of 45 minutes ago. It paused. The accounts he has joint authority over, he can still access those, but any movement will be captured in real time and I will be notified immediately. Good, Agent Lowe said. She had been writing continuously since Frank started speaking. Number 4. Marcus wrote it on the board, then turned around and looked at me. The farm, he said. Carol. He picked up my phone and called her. She answered on the second ring, the way she always answered, not breathlessly, not with the performance of urgency, just present and ready, the way she was always present and ready, which was one of the reasons I had trusted her with Margaret's property for 18 years. Carol, I said, I need to ask you to do something tonight, and I need you to understand that I cannot give you all the details right now, but I need you to trust me. A pause, sort, not uncertain, just Carol being Carol, which meant she was already deciding how much of what I was saying she needed and how much she could fill in on her own. Tell me what you need, she said. The security cameras on the property, the ones we installed after the equipment theft 2 years ago. Are they operational? Yes, sir. I'll 6. I need you to make sure they are recording tonight. Every feed. The full evening. Tim Stampede. He paused. And I need you to let Daniel in when he arrives without giving him any reason to think the evening is anything other than what he expects it to be. Can you do that? Another pause, shorter this time. Mr. Bennett, she said, and her voice had the particular quality it had the morning she stood at the edge of that hole in the garden. The voice of a woman who understood more than she had been told and was choosing to act on what she understood rather than what she could prove. I have been taking care of this property for 18 years. I know how to answer a door. My throat tightened. I know you do, I said. Thank you, Carol. Is there anything else? She asked. Make sure there is coffee, I said. The good kind. Margaret always said that a house that offered bad coffee to its guests was a house that did not take hospitality seriously. A sound came through the phone that was almost a laugh, not quite, but close enough that it loosened something in my chest that had been wound tight since 5 that morning. He will put on the Sumatra blend, Carol said. She always liked that one best. He ended the call. Agent Lowe was watching me when I looked up. She will hold, she said. Not a question. She will hold, I confirmed. Lo wrote something in her portfolio and moved on. My team will arrive at the farm in 2 vehicles at 3:30. We will stage in the utility building on the north side of the property, far enough from the house that Daniel will not see us. When he pulls in close enough to enter within 90 seconds of the signal, she looked at me. The signal is you opening the living room door. When that door opens, we come in. Understood, I said. One more thing. She closed the portfolio and looked at me with the directness I had already come to understand was simply how she operated, not unkind, not performative, just honest. Tonight is going to be difficult in ways that have nothing to do with the legal proceedings. You are going to sit across from your son, and you are going to watch him try to take something from you, and you are going to have to let him believe he is succeeding long enough for him to say the words that close this case. She paused. I have done this kind of work for 23 years. I have seen people in your position hold, and I have seen people crack. The ones who hold are not the ones who feel less. They are the ones who remember why they are doing it. The room was very quiet. He thought about Margaret's composition notebook. 83 pages, 14 months of 5 in the morning in a garden she loved, writing down things she did not want to know but could not pretend she did not know because pretending had never been something she was built for. He thought about the 2 words she had scratched into the lid of that metal box with her own hands. Richard, open this alone. She had trusted me with this. She had built the entire thing around the belief that when the time came, I would be equal to it. She had said so in the letter in her careful handwriting on the good cream stationery. I believe you are equal to it. I remember why I am doing it, I said. Marcus had been watching me from the end of the table. He set his pen down and picked up his legal pad and turned to the last page where he had been writing the final version of the evening sequence. At the very bottom of the page, below the last numbered item, he paused and then wrote one additional line. Not the task, not a procedural step, just a name. He turned the pad toward me so I could see it. Daniel. Used the name alone on the line. The way you write a name when you need to remember that behind everything else, behind the fraud and the wire transfers and the Delaware Shell Company and the flight to Cancun with no return booking, there is still a person. A person you raised. A person who wrote a letter to his mother that he never sent and never threw away. He pushed back from the table. I picked up my keys from the surface where I had set them when I walked in. I looked around the archive room at Frank, who had aged 10 years in 4 hours and was still at his keyboard doing what needed to be done, at Marcus, who was already on his phone arranging the document substitution, at Agent Lowe, who was texting her team with the calm efficiency of someone staging a play she had staged many times before. I will be at the farm by 2, I said. I need an hour alone before anyone else arrives. Nobody argued. Nobody offered to accompany me. They understood, or they chose to behave as though they did, which amounted to the same thing. I walked out through the chairman's entrance, rode the elevator down to the sublevel, and got into my truck. The seat was warm from the morning sun coming through the windshield. He sat there for 30 seconds with both hands on the wheel and did not start the engine. Then I started it and drove. The farm looked different in the afternoon light. He had driven this lane in every season and every hour, but the October afternoon light had a particular quality I had forgotten, or maybe had not allowed myself to remember. A low amber slant that came over the tree-line along the north fence and lay across the fields and lawn, warm bars, the kind of light that made even damaged things look like they were worth saving. The fallen oak cast an enormous shadow across the rose bed. And for a moment, coming around the final curve in the lane, I saw the whole scene as Margaret might have seen it, not as destruction, but as rearrangement. Something old had come down. The ground beneath it had opened up. What happened next depended entirely on what you chose to put back. He parked the truck and sat behind the wheel for a moment, looking at the farmhouse. It was 112 years old. Margaret had found it in a state of what the listing had generously called original condition and what was more accurately described as 3 generations of deferred maintenance. She had spent the first 2 years stripping it back to what it actually was: good bones, good proportions, the kind of structure that had survived a century because someone had built it with the intention of it lasting. She had said once, standing in the kitchen with plaster dust in her hair and a look on her face that I had loved unreservedly, "Richard, this house has been waiting for someone to pay attention to it. That is all it needed, just attention." He had thought she was talking about the house. He got out of the truck. The air smelled of wet earth and fallen leaves and the faint sweet undertone of the Sumatra coffee Carol had already put on. The smell drifting out through the kitchen window screen, the way smells did in old houses that had never been sealed tight enough to keep the outside entirely outside. He stood in the yard for a moment and breathed it in, and my chest ached with something I did not have a precise name for, but that felt, if I held it carefully and did not rush past it. The sun was setting over the farm when I finally walked back to the house. The sky had turned that particular shade of orange and pink that Margaret had always called God's watercolor, and I stood on the porch for a moment just watching it, letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket. The past few days had been a hurricane of revelations and confrontations, of truths uncovered and lies exposed, of a son lost and a wife's love rediscovered. And now, standing on the porch of the house she had loved, I felt something I had not felt in 3 years: peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from remembering fully and accepting completely. Carol came out with 2 mugs of coffee, the Sumatra blend Margaret had always loved. She handed me one and stood beside me, looking out at the garden where the restoration crew had been working all day. The fallen oak had been cut into manageable pieces and hauled away. The hole had been filled and graded. The rose bed had been cleared of debris and turned over, ready for new plants. And in the east corner, the young oak Margaret had planted stood tall and unbowed, its leaves catching the last light of the day. "The nursery called," Carol said quietly. "They have the old blush china roses you wanted. 6 plants. They can deliver Monday." He nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Monday. A new beginning. A new spring. A new chance to grow something beautiful from the soul that had been torn open. He thought about everything that had happened in the past 72 hours. The storm that had brought down the oak. The box buried beneath its roots. Margaret's letter, her notebook, her careful documentation of Daniel's betrayal. The FBI. Agent Law. Marcus and Frank working through the night to build a case. The confrontation in the kitchen, Daniel's face when he realized he had been caught, the handcuffs clicking into place, the sound of the door closing behind him. And then the letter I had found in the family album, the one Daniel had written to his mother, the one she had kept because she believed the person who wrote it was still somewhere inside the man he had become. He had read that letter 3 times now, and each time it broke something open in me that I had been keeping closed for too long. "Did he call?" he asked Carol. "Daniel?" She shook her head. "Not yet. But his lawyer called Marcus this morning. Is cooperating fully. Is giving them everything, names, accounts, dates, everything. Agent Lowe said it's the most complete confession she's ever seen. He took a long drink of the coffee and let the warmth spread through my chest. That's something, I said. That's more than I expected. Carol was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the garden. You know, she said slowly, Margaret always believed in second chances. She believed that people could change, that the person they were at their worst was not the person they had to be forever. That's why she kept that letter. That's why she never told you what she knew. She was waiting for him to come back to himself. I know, I said. I understand that now. Do you? Carol turned to look at me, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of the setting sun. Because I have been watching you, M.R. Bennett. I have been watching you for 18 years. And I know how much you love her. And I know how much you love him. And I need to know that you are not going to let what he did destroy the family that she spent her whole life building. I set my coffee down on the porch railing and took Carol's hands in mine. They were rough and work-worn, the hands of a woman who had spent her life taking care of things that mattered. Carol, I said, do you know what I found in that second box? The one she buried under the young oak in the east corner. She shook her head. I found a photo album. Pictures of us, Margaret and me, Daniel as a boy, our life together. And I found a letter she wrote me in her last months. She said something in that letter that I have been thinking about all day. She said, the things worth keeping are not the ones that never suffer. They are the ones that suffered and came back anyway. Carol's eyes filled with tears. That sounds like her. She also said, I continued, that Daniel is not only what he has done, and I am not only my response to it. Whatever happens, I should not let what he has become be the last word on who our family was. Carol squeezed my hands. And what are you going to do with that? He looked out at the garden, at the young oak standing in the east corner, at the freshly turned soil where the roses would be planted Monday, at the sky that was slowly fading from orange to purple to the deep blue of evening. I am going to give him a chance, I said. Not a free pass. Not forgiveness without accountability. But a chance. When he gets out. And he will get out, because he is cooperating and because he is still young enough to rebuild his life. I am going to be here. I am going to be his father. I am going to help him find his way back to who he was supposed to be. Carol nodded slowly. That is what she would have wanted. I know, I said. That is why I am going to do it. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table, Margaret's table, and I opened the photo album she had buried beneath the young oak. I turned the pages slowly, looking at the faces of people I had loved and lost and was learning to love again. There was Margaret in the garden, laughing with her head tipped back. There was Daniel at 6 years old, sitting on the porch steps with mud on both knees. There was our wedding day, Margaret in white, me in my best suit, both of us too young to understand how hard marriage could be but too in love to care. There was Daniel at 18, leaning against the fence post in the east field, trying to look like he had already figured everything out. And there, tucked into the back sleeve of the album, was the letter he had written to his mother, the one she had kept all these years, the one that proved she had never given up on him. He unfolded it and read it again. Man, I know you know. I have known that you know for 6 months, and I have been waiting for you to say something, and you haven't. And I don't understand if that means you are giving me a chance or if it means you have given up on me or if it means something else that I am not able to figure out from the outside. I want to stop. I have wanted to stop for 2 years, and I don't know how to anymore. The people I owe money to are not the kind of people you negotiate with. I am not telling you this so you will fix it. I don't think it can be fixed. I am telling you because I am running out of places to put it, and you are the only person I have ever been able to tell the truth to, and I haven't been telling you the truth, and I can't keep carrying what that costs. I didn't tell Dad because I can't stand the thought of him looking at me the way he is going to look at me when he finds out. I know that is a coward's reason. I know it doesn't change anything. I just need you to know that I know what I have become, and it is not what I meant to become, and I am sorry. I am sorry for all of it. I don't know how to be sorrier than I am right now. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the album. Then I took out my phone and called Marcus. I need to see Daniel, I said. Tomorrow. Can you arrange it? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Richard, are you sure that is a good idea? I don't know if it is a good idea, I said. But it is the right idea. And I think Margaret would have wanted me to do it. I will make the call, Marcus said. I will call you back. He ended the call and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the farmhouse, and I let myself feel everything I had been holding at bay for 3 years. The grief for Margaret. The anger at Daniel. The guilt for all the things I should have seen and did not. The hope that maybe, just maybe, it was not too late for any of us. Outside, the last light of the day faded into night, and the stars began to appear one by one over the Virginia countryside. Carol came in to say good night. She was wearing her barn jacket and carrying her keys, and she looked at me with the steady, knowing gaze that had been my anchor through all of this. I will see you Monday, she said. When the roses come. He stood up and hugged her. Not the brief, restrained hug of employer and employee, but the real hug of two people who had been through something together and come out the other side. Thank you, Carol, I said. For everything. She hugged me back, tight and warm. She would be proud of you, Mr. Bennett. You know that, right? I am trying to be, I said. She pulled back and looked at me with eyes that were bright in the dim light of the kitchen. You are already there, she said. You just don't know it yet. And then she was gone, the side door closing softly behind her, the sound of her car starting in the driveway, the crunch of gravel as she pulled away. And I was alone in the farmhouse, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future. The next morning, I drove to the detention center. The visitation room was the same as it had been the last time I was here, the same plastic chairs, the same scratched counter, the same smell of floor cleaner and burnt coffee. He sat down on my side of the glass and waited. Daniel came through the door 14 minutes later. He was wearing the same gray standard issue clothing, and his face was drawn and tired, but there was something different about him, something that had not been there before. The composure he had carried like armor was gone. What was left underneath was raw and real, the face of a man who had hit bottom and was looking up at the small sliver of light that might, just might, let him out. He sat down and picked up the phone. He picked up mine. I read your letter, I said. The one you wrote to your mother. His face crumpled. For a moment, he could not speak. He pressed his free hand against the counter and breathed hard, and I could see him fighting to hold himself together. I wrote that 2 years before she died, he said finally. His voice was thick. I never thought she would see it. He left it in the album because I did not know what else to do with it. He thought maybe she would find it after I was gone. She found it, I said. She kept it. She kept it in the album with the birthday photographs and the summers on the farm, like it belonged there. Danielle's eyes filled with tears. I did not deserve her. No, I said. You did not. But she believed in you anyway. She believed that the person who wrote that letter was still there somewhere. And I have spent the past few days trying to figure out if she was right. He looked at me through the glass, and his face was the face of a man who had been drowning and had just been offered a hand. Was she? He asked. His voice was so quiet I almost could not hear it. Dad, was she right? He looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man he had become, the person he might still become. And I thought about Margaret's letter, the one she had buried under the young oak. The things worth keeping are not the ones that never suffer. They are the ones that suffered and came back anyway. I do not know yet, I said. But I am willing to find out. I am willing to give you a chance. Not a free pass, you have to earn that. But a chance. Starting now. Daniel bowed his head, and I could see his shoulders shaking with the effort of holding back sobs. I will earn it, he said. I will spend the rest of my life earning it if I have to. That is a good start, I said. Now tell me everything. Tell me about Garrett Shaw. Tell me about the lending network. Tell me about the debt and how it started and where it went. And do not leave anything out because I am going to be the one who decides what happens next, and I need to know everything. Daniel looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had not seen in years, not the controlled urgency of a man managing a crisis, but the genuine desperation of a man who had finally stopped running. I will tell you everything, he said. And he did. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about the gambling, about the debt that had started small and grown like a cancer, about the people who had circled him like sharks the moment he could not pay. He told me about Garrett Shaw, about the way he had offered a way out that turned out to be a way deeper in. He told me about the consulting firms, the fake invoices, the shell companies, the money that moved through them like water through a sieve. And he told me about the night the storm came, the night the oak came down, the night he realized that everything he had been hiding was about to be uncovered. I thought I could get out, he said. I thought if I could just get the money, if I could just get to Cancun, I could disappear and start over. But I could not stop thinking about Mom. He kept thinking about how disappointed she would be. And I kept thinking about you, how you would look at me when you found out. And I could not figure out how to live with that. He reached across the counter and pressed my hand against the glass. Daniel raised his hand and pressed it against his side. You are going to do the right thing now, I said. You are going to cooperate with the FBI. You are going to tell them everything, and you are going to accept whatever consequences come. And when you are done, when you have paid your debt to society, you are going to come back to the farm and you are going to help me plant roses. Daniel's face broke open then, and he cried the way he had not cried since he was a child, the deep, heaving sobs of a man who had been holding it together for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to let go. And I sat on my side of the glass, and I let him cry, because that was what fathers did for their sons when the world had fallen apart and there was nothing left to do but start building it back up again. When I left the detention center, the sun was high and bright, and the October air was crisp and clean. He stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing it in, letting the warmth of the sun soak into my bones. Then I got in my truck and drove back to the farm. The restoration crew was gone. The property was quiet. The garden was a clean slate waiting for new life. And standing on the porch, waiting for me with 2 mugs of coffee, was Carol. "The roses are coming Monday," she said. "I know," I said. "I will be here." She handed me a mug and looked out at the garden. "And Daniel?" He took a long drink of the coffee. "He is coming too," I said. "Not yet. But eventually. And when he does, I want to make sure this place is ready for him." Carol nodded slowly. "That is what Margaret would have wanted." "I know," I said. "That is why I am doing it." He walked out to the east corner and stood in front of the young oak. The leaves were turning, the colors brilliant against the blue sky. And I thought about Margaret, about the way she had laughed, the way she had loved, the way she had believed in second chances even when the person who needed one had not deserved it. He knelt down and pressed my hand into the soil at the base of the tree. "I am going to try," I said out loud, as if she could hear me. "I am going to try to be the person you believed I could be. I am going to try to forgive him. I am going to try to forgive myself. And I am going to try to keep this garden growing, because that is what you would have wanted." A breeze moved through the branches of the young oak, and the leaves rustled like laughter. He stood up and walked back to the house, and I felt lighter than I had in 3 years. The storm had come. The storm had passed. And in its wake, something new was beginning to grow. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything.